Hi, I'm Monica Williams with USDA's Agricultural Research Service, and today we are here at the U.S. National Arboretum with experts who will be talking to you and answering your questions about gardening. Christine and Bradley, can you introduce yourselves to our viewers and tell them a little bit about what you do here?
I'm Christine Moore. I am the horticulturist for the National Herb Garden, and I've been working in this garden for almost 25 years. It's a 2.5 acre garden, and it keeps us very busy.
My name is Bradley Evans. I manage the gardens around the visitor center as well as the 115,000 gallon water garden, and I've been working here for 18 years.
So there's a lot of gardening expertise between the two of us, so you guys have a good day ahead of you.
So, okay, we know that the Arboretum is huge. It's like, what, 400 some acres?
About 450 now. I think they've moved the fence a couple times, and I think we've gained a few in the last few years, yes.
Okay, and so tell our viewers where we are right now. I know it's huge, but where are we right now?
We're in the northeast quadrant of Washington, D.C., just bordering Maryland. So you've got people that come here from all over the world, but primarily I would say Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and even Pennsylvania. Those are our closest neighbors that frequent the Arboretum.
Okay, so we're not gonna waste any time. We're gonna get right into the questions because we have quite a few to get through. Our first question, what kind of pot should I use? How deep and wide should the pots or planter box be?
I would say, and Brad, you can corroborate with me if you want, but for the most part, I think you should keep it proportional to the size of the plant. For example, these are just little weeny things that aren't going to get much bigger than this. So putting them in a pot about this size would be appropriate. This plant, for example, this is a lantana. By the end of the summer, this thing is probably going to be about that big. So it's important that you know your plant, first of all, and what its ultimate size is going to be at the end of the season. So while this is in here for making pretty for today, I would probably think this planter might be a little small for this one by the end of the season. You're going to end up watering this thing a lot. But if you have a bigger plant, for example, maybe a small tree or citrus plant, a planter this size is probably more appropriate. You certainly do not want to put this guy in here because that would just be a little bit out of scale. And I think, as far as it being wide or what have you, that's a little bit of an aesthetic issue more than anything. Whether you want it to be more wide like this because you want it to have a flatter display. Otherwise, I think, again, it's just sort of proportionate to the plant that you're going to use in the end.
Okay, so since we're talking about these plants, can you tell us what do we have here?
Brad, you want to start with that one?
Sure, with this one right here?
Yeah.
So we've got a columnar variegated basil, we've got a rose scented thyme, we've got sage.
Yep, that's a regular sage that you would use for cooking, Thanksgiving dinner, or if you're in Scotland, they put sage in their hamburgers. And then this one is a chili pepper. It's got these nice purple leaves there. I often tell people you don't necessarily have to grow peppers just for eating the fruit. They're very ornamental as well, as you can see with the purple leaves there. You want to do this?
And this is a mixed container of all different types of succulents. We've got echeveria right here. We've got two different types of kalanchoe. This is blue chalk sticks. This is a dwarf-leaved jade plant, and then this right here is a mangave.
So are all of those easy to find if we were looking for those, or?
Some of these are easy to find, and some of them you really have to sort of hunt for them online. But I've chosen a selection of plants, including the echeveria, the kalanchoe, and then the blue chalk sticks, which are fairly easy to acquire at any garden center, as well as the jade. Mm-hmm. But like the mangave is a little harder to find.
Yeah. In this container here, we have a variegated oregano, which smells just like regular oregano, but it's got these beautiful leaves. This is a scented pelargonium or scented geranium. So if you rub the leaves, they have varying scents to them, like maybe rose or peppermint. Some are chocolate, lemon. This is a rose scented thyme. Ooh. This guy here is pineapple sage. Rub that leaf and you'll get a good sniff of pineapple when you.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it does smell like pineapple.
Yes.
And you can use it in tea or to bake with it. Rosemary, this one is very common for many people. This is a smaller version of it. Again, we were talking about basil. This is another type of basil. It's just a little weedy guy that stays shaped like this. So you may not want to cook with this as much, but it's great in a container. You know, you can certainly swap things out like that if you wanted to and add a little bit of variety. This one is lemon verbena. And again, rub that leaf and smell that, Monica.
Oh my gosh, it's almost like perfume.
I know, it's very strong of lemon
Smells
there.
really
It's
good.
a great one. But this one's little right now. As the season goes on, it will get to be much bigger and wider than this. So if you were going to use this in a container, you want to know the personality of the plant that you're growing, because if you put this in a little thing here, it's going to struggle later on in the season because it wants to be much bigger and maybe in a pot more like this size over there.
And that would be good in tea too, right?
Yes,
Oh,
this is
I could
great for
imagine.
tea. You can infuse it into like custards or, you know, I don't want to say jello, but something, you know, a decorative jello maybe.
Yes.
And this is bay leaf like you would have. This is just a little cutting we have, but eventually this will get to be a much bigger plant. Semi-hardy here in the mid-Atlantic, not so much up north. Down south it does much better. So we probably want to keep this in a container so you can move it in and out. And then this is basil, your typical Italian basil that, you know, you mix with your tomato and mozzarella with a little olive oil on top, or spaghetti sauce, pesto, you name it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these are some different ones. And I mentioned the scented geranium before. This is another type of scented geranium. Has a totally different fragrance to it, and it has this pink and white variegation to it. So if you like something with a little more personality to it than a plain green one, there's plenty to go around for that.
Okay, our next question. What are the challenges to maintaining a container garden?
We both look at each other because we have both done a lot of container gardening in our careers. And I will tell you, sometimes things work and sometimes they don't. And I certainly wouldn't get frustrated if something fails the first time or what have you. I mean, we're always learning what plants do well in containers and can we push the envelope sometimes with things. I would say for us, you'll hear this repeatedly, light is one thing, water is the next. I tell all my staff the hardest thing to learn about gardening is proper watering, especially in containers. So, Brad, you can talk about your experience, but
Well, I think another huge limiting factor with success for successes in container gardening is fertilizer. If you forget to fertilize, the plants are going to grow. If you just water, because most potting mixes contain peat moss, bark, and maybe some coconut fiber, which is nutrient poor. And so I would suggest with a lot of containers putting in a slow release fertilizer, so you have at least 2.5 months. Every time you water, fertilizer goes in.
Okay.
And so you don't have to worry about mixing, you know, your liquid feed fertilizer for containers. But that's really what gets your plants to grow and flower is the fertilizer.
one thing to keep in mind too, to Brad's point, all of these plants are normally growing in the ground where there's plenty of nutrition available to them. When you put them in a container, they do not have access to the nearby soil. So you are the only source of nutrition for that plant for the time that you have it. So as he said, adding the slow release fertilizer, and even as he and I discussed the other day, adding some liquid fertilizer, maybe a low dose every once in a while, maybe every once or twice a month, will just give them a little bit of extra. It's kind of like drinking the 7-Eleven Slurpee, you know, just a little bit to push them over the edge. But you're the only source of their food. So if you don't provide it to them, they're going to struggle.
That's a very good point. Okay. Our next question, how often do I need to water my plants? Should there be drainage at the bottom of the container?
I think it depends on, again, what type of plant you're growing. As Brad mentioned with the succulents, you can get away with watering them once a week, more or less, depending on how many you put in a container.
And even less than that if it rains.
Correct. And I will usually tell people that if you're somebody who travels a lot, or you don't really have a green thumb, but you like having containers or plant material around your living quarters, do this succulents, because they will tolerate not being watered a lot better than many of these other plants there. So he has a lot of success with that, and then the occasional watering. For a lot of the plants like these, whether they're culinary or they're just kind of the frou-frou, you know, pretty flowers, it sort of depends on how hot it is, how much sun you're getting. You can literally stick your finger into the soil, and if you feel moisture there, you're probably good. If it starts to feel like you know, it's a paper
Yeah.
in there. It's so light, you're going to need to water it. And so the bigger they get, the more water they're going to need over the course of the summer. Right now, if I had just planted this, I might water this once every, 2 or 3 days, assuming how much sun it is or dry. As the summer goes on, I might be watering this every day.
Okay.
So the biggest thing to check is if you stick your finger in there and it feels pretty dry, you need to water it. If it seems
Like within the top inch or two of the
Yeah.
soil, that's pretty much an indicator for the entirety of.
yeah.
Okay.
The biggest
The
thing is
pot.
lift it. If you
Okay.
need to do a demo for yourself, water a plant and then don't water a plant and see what the two feel like there, and you want to be somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
The biggest killer of many plants is too much water. Some people think I've got to just soak that sucker every stinking day, and you might end up waterlogging it to the point where you kill it.
Right.
And the sure sign, sometimes people are like, oh, look, it's wilting, it needs more water. When actually you might have the roots rotting.
Oh.
And when the roots rot, it can't take any water up, so it's going to wilt just because by virtue of it having no way to take anything up. So you can water it all day long, and you're just killing it. So water one, have one dry, and then somewhere in the middle of those is a good test.
That's good.
And always make sure that all your containers have drainage holes in them,
Yes.
because some of them don't. Some of theirs are sold kind of close by the other containers, and they're made just to be a liner for an indoor plant with no drainage. So you put a pot in that pot. So that's a common mistake. Like, that's a pretty container, but
Yeah.
there's no hole in the bottom.
Yeah, so
And
you want to
that
make
is
sure
not
that
good.
there's something where the water can drain out in the bottom. Yep.
So, which brings me to another point. What about rocks? Can you put rocks or pebbles in the bottom of your pot? Will that help with drainage?
How much physics do you want to get into in this talk? I would say old school, people would put rocks or gravel in the bottom. The more current science following the nature of water is that when water hits a new surface like that, like it goes through the soil and then it hits rock, it tends to pool there before it drains out. So you might actually end up having water hanging out longer than you need it to. If you were going to add any drainage, or you need to maybe the soil isn't very light and fluffy, then you might add some sort of material, not rocks necessarily, unless you're doing succulents. That's sort of a different soil mixture. You would do it throughout, not at the bottom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So for the most part, save yourself the trouble. Don't bother with the rocks. It's just old school. Don't worry.
Got it. Okay, here's our next question. How often, I think you might have touched on this, how often do you recommend fertilizing?
I mean, if you're not going to use a slow release fertilizer, I would say maybe once every 2 weeks, half strength,
Yes.
whatever's recommended on the box. And another issue with fertilizer, a lot of people like to go the organic route with water soluble fertilizers, like a fish emulsion but that can attract animals. That can attract raccoons, that can attract rats to dig in your containers because they're looking for something to eat.
Yes.
So the salt-based fertilizers will not do that. That's another concern. That people wonder why people, their plants are being attacked by animals randomly, and that's because they're attracted to the smell.
Yeah, most organic fertilizers are made of fish emulsion.
Oh.
So little raccoons love that, and they're like, oh, there's something fun in here, and let me just throw all your plants out while you're there. And meanwhile, they're all dead because they're dried out. Brad, I was wondering, because I don't actually know this answer, is there a special fertilizer for succulents that's different than the rest, or do you use the same?
No, it's the same well-balanced fertilizer for them as well. And I don't even use any kind of special mix for my succulents either. It's just straight potting soil.
Okay.
So not cactus soil or anything. Okay.
I think when you get into actual cacti, because these are succulents,
Yeah.
they're a little more picky about how much drainage, how much sand is in there around their roots.
Okay.
But with succulents, they're a lot less picky.
All right, on to our next question. Oh, and if you're just joining us, We are here at the U.S. National Arboretum with our experts, Christine and Bradley, and they are talking about gardening and offering their gardening tips so that you can have a successful garden. So our next question, what is the difference between perennials, annuals, and biannuals?
Annuals complete their whole life cycle in one season. So you plant this little guy, well, actually not that. We'll go with the basil, for example. We'll start this from seed in the greenhouse. It'll grow up to a plant. It'll start to flower and set seed. And then by the end of the season, the end of fall or whatever, it'll die. So it does the whole reproduction cycle from seed to seed in one season. A biennial takes 2 seasons. So the first year, it'll just put up leaves. And then the following year, it'll do leaves and flower and set seed, and then it dies. A perennial will do that whole reproduction cycle on a multi-year basis. So it doesn't die after 1 year, 2 years. It could live for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, and depending on where you are in the United States. So a plant that's an annual for us here in the Mid-Atlantic might be perennial or nearly so in a place like Texas. For example, basil. I know I have Texas gardener friends and they have basil growing 3 feet tall and it almost overwinters for them. Whereas if you're in Wisconsin, you're going to get lucky if you can have that last for a couple of months up there. It's definitely not going to overwinter. This plant, like I mentioned, this is perennial. This comes back every year. Just keep in mind though that plants are like humans and that they do eventually die at some point. So you don't necessarily have to think that you've done something wrong. If it's an annual and it dies at the end of season, that might be what it's supposed to do. Whereas a perennial, it might last for many years.
And whereas like something like succulents don't really fall within any of that. I mean, you would need to take them in, especially in this area, if you want to keep them over winter. But, places like southern Florida, southern Texas, southern California, they're landscape plants that are existing year round.
Right. And that is a key point too. Depending on where you are in the country, plants behave differently. So again, what's annual or perennial for us may not be for someone living in Maine. And that's something that I think new gardeners can probably go to their local extension agency to find out what plants are successful in their area and what to expect so that they have success in the gardens.
Okay, great. Okay, on to our next question. Is it better to buy small perennials or larger ones that have blossoms or buds?
Wow.
That's a good question.
That might be some personal preference. If we're talking container plants, I would start out small and then you have all season for the plant to grow. Sometimes if you buy a plant that's already starting to mature when you buy it, you will have less time with that plant during your normal growing season. And if it's a tree or something like that, again, I would start smaller and then let it flourish, I guess, for over a longer period of time. If you're looking for some instantaneous display, maybe you have guests coming over, then obviously you're going to want to buy something that's already in flower, and you can do that. You just have to know that you may not have as long with that plant in the end.
But the only other thing is it's more economical to buy smaller with perennials, because eventually you will have that larger plant. It'll just take longer. If you have the patience and you want that plant, then you can afford it as a smaller plant rather than something that costs $20, $30.
Right.
Yes. So thrifty. I'm a thrifty person, so I'm going to buy the smallest thing I can because I know that eventually it's going to get this big at the end of the season. Other people are like, no, I want to have instant display. If you've got an open wallet, you go for it because you're going to pay for the bigger size. But personal choice.
Yes. Okay. All right. So what kind of potting mix is best for my plants?
Well, generally, I would say something that involves a lot of drainage. Like you might be tempted to go to a garden center and pick up, a bag of compost or a bag of topsoil, and it holds too much water. I find that mixes that contain peat moss, bark, and coconut fiber allow enough porosity for keep those roots happy, but also allow for enough water storage, holding the water around those roots just long enough for keep those plants happy.
Yeah, so if you're going to a garden center, look for a bag that says potting soil on it, not topsoil, not compost. Topsoil and compost are for the actual garden itself, not for a container plant.
But it's tempting because it's a lot of times cheaper.
Yes.
I'm laughing because that was my first mistake. I used topsoil and the plants didn't turn out very well.
I think my mother did that too, and it wasn't until after I started gardening myself here professionally, I was like, oh no, Mom, that is not how you do things. But we all have to learn. It's, you learn from your mistakes. It's all good.
Okay. All right, here's our next question. What are some of the easiest herbs to grow? And I know we have an herb garden here, right? So on top of that, how many plants do we have in the herb garden here at the Arboretum?
We have about 800 to 900 different kinds of herbs in here. And I know that's shocking for most people because in the general public, they think of an herb as culinary or maybe medicinal, but our definition of an herb is much broader than that. And so we can grow a lot of different kinds of plants there. But what was the rest of the question?
What are some of the easiest ones to grow?
Oh, the easiest ones, right. No, they're all hard. No, I'm just kidding. I actually pulled some of the easier ones to grow, and they don't require a big investment or anything like that if you don't want to. If they get scraggly at the end of the season, just pitch them, no big deal. And I did mention the Salvia elegans. This is the pineapple sage. You can have that in a container or put it in the ground. It gets this big. It has red flowers that the hummingbirds love, so this is a great choice. It's very easy. If you're into taking cuttings of things, you could easily do that. I don't have my pruners on me, but you could even do cuttings from this. The lemon verbena, again, smells great. Easy, throw it in a container or in the ground, does its own thing. I would say these pelargoniums, they're beautiful. They get bigger. They do require a little more maintenance because they can get a little tatty looking with some of their older leaves, but they more than make up for it in their appearance. Lantanas, I mean, this is one of the easiest plants to grow and to start out with, especially if you like color. I mean, you really can't go wrong with lantanas. And this is not an herb, but per se, I mean, our definition, it falls in there, but for most people, it would just be more for color.
Good drought tolerance and great for pollinators.
Yep.
Oh, awesome.
Yep.
Okay. And then basil too.
Basil,
right?
yes. I mean, if you like making pesto or Italian or whatever, you can even do Thai basil if you like cooking with Thai food. You can select some of those varieties. This is a creeping thyme. Again, if you might have heard them talk about using a thrillers, fillers and spillers in your container, and so I will periodically use things like thyme or the oregano to just spill over the side, and they're useful. Oh. They don't require a lot of maintenance. They're colorful. Come visit the National Herb Garden and we'll give you more information than you need on what plants to grow that are easy and hard.
Okay, orchids. And Mother's Day was just here, so I'm sure a lot of mothers probably got orchids. Can orchids and succulents be grown together?
I would recommend that they not be grown together because succulents require a lot more intense light than orchids do. Orchids generally need a lot more shade, and their leaves will burn and they will die if they were placed in the same conditions as succulents do. Well,
and can you tell us a little bit about that pot? I see there's a lot of holes. Is that for air or is that for water?
The holes are in order to have all this long fiber sphagnum and bark in here dry out evenly, because like a lot of different plants, you can overwater them. Mm-hmm. And with orchids, you want that long fiber sphagnum to dry out almost entirely before you water soak all of this again. And you want to make sure that you soak everything, and so no dry pockets occur.
Okay, and so you said that's bark, and what is on the top there?
Oh, this is long fiber sphagnum moss.
So as professionals, we use a lot of jargon. We know sort of the basic names of things. So I know this is long fiber sphagnum, but is this something that public would find in the nursery or garden center? Is that what it's called for them, or is there some other name they should look for?
I've seen it commonly as orchid moss.
Orchid moss.
Orchid moss, and it's usually in like the houseplant section, not too far from where the orchids are being sold. Mm-hmm. It can be confusing because there's other products like peat moss, mm-hmm. which is basically the ground fine version of that, which is more for your regular plant containers and will not be sufficient for any type of epiphytic, aka tree-dwelling orchids.
Okay. And so our next orchid question is, after my orchid is done blooming, should I cut the stem and why?
Especially with moth orchids, also known as Phalaenopsis, more commonly available orchid, you can cut them back to the third node from the plant in order to initiate a few more flower buds if you want to continue the display. Otherwise, I would cut it all the way back to the plant because you want that plant to get bigger for next year's flowering to happen.
Okay.
So you have to wait a whole nother year for it to flower again.
For Phalaenopsis, a lot of times, but other orchids flower more frequently.
Okay.
It all depends. It's the largest plant family on the earth, so
So you just
very
have to
diverse.
pretend that it's a house plant after that and water it accordingly.
Correct. You have to
Okay.
be patient, unfortunately.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of these other plants are very, they do what you want to do right when you buy them. Whereas orchids, it's just a different type of care.
Timeline, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what about the stem, or no, I think they're roots that you see coming out over top of the pot. This one doesn't seem to have it, but some of them I've seen like that.
Well, the reason why this doesn't have that is because this was recently repotted. So with moth orchids, it's helpful to make sure that the leaves are right at the same level as the long fiber sphagnum moss, because they're going to keep growing upward. And then as they grow upward, they're going to produce roots that will eventually, sort of
Escape their
potentially,
container.
yeah. And you want to keep those misted because that's part of the plant. And then the opportunity to correct that is when you repot it again another year or two. You can put the plant back in, cut those roots off, and so you'll end up with something that looks like this again.
Do you put the plant in a bigger or newer pot, or can you put it back in the same size pot?
I mean, it all depends. This is a miniature Phalaenopsis, so this is not going to be a large grower, whereas other moth orchids will increase in size, and then you will need to increase the pot to accommodate all those new roots with that larger plant.
And if you are just joining us, we are here with experts at the U.S. National Arboretum, and they're talking to us about gardening. And so our next question, I want to grow plants under my deck. What are good choices?
Dead ones? That's sorry. No offense to the person who asked the question, but he and I were both very curious. Why would you want to grow plants under the deck? And unless you have maybe a 2-tiered deck and there's shade or something like that. So we were trying to think, what does the person mean exactly?
It must be a high deck.
I know. Yes, exactly. So to go back to an earlier statement, if you're growing under a deck, that's going to be shade, and you're going to want to go for shade tolerant plants. If you go to your local nursery or garden center, more often than not, they're going to have a shade tolerant section, and that's where you want to spend your time. You can grow hostas in containers, assuming you don't have little Bambi walking up in your yard and deciding to check out your deck. But anything shade oriented would be much better. You don't want to do anything sun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, here's our next question. Do you have any propagation tips for growing plants from seeds and cuttings?
I want to say try easy plants first. If you haven't had a lot of experience doing seed sowing or doing propagation by cuttings, do easy stuff like sunflowers are easy from seed, marigolds, even basil is very easy from
Zinnias.
seed. Zinnias, some of those common garden plants. You can sprinkle those on the top of some potting soil like this if you want. Don't bury them because a lot of times seeds may need a little bit of light for germination. And then just keep them gently watered. Again, is it light or is it heavy kind of thing. And eventually you'll see some guys sprouting up, and later if you're gentle, you can tease those little seedlings out and transplant them into other pots like around this size or out into the garden. Cuttings are a different story. If you don't have experience with it, I would say that might be the next level of gardening experience needed. But again, there are some plants that are very easy to do from cuttings. This Salvia elegans here, the pineapple sage, is pretty easy. If I had my pruner, sorry, but you would cut this off and strip off some of the lower leaves, roll it in a little bit of rooting hormone, and then you can put it again in a pot like this, and then just keep it gently watered, and then eventually it'll produce a new plant with roots on there that you could then move around, put in a container out in the garden. But again, if you go to your extension agency or something, they're going to have all kinds of good information there on how to do that next level of gardening if you want to move that far. Yep.
And as far as cuttings go, when it comes to succulents, with a lot of the succulents that are, have more of like a stem to them, elongated stem like this dwarf jade, you can do cuttings off of that. And the trick is with succulent cuttings is you cut them, you leave them, you kind of forget about them for about 2 weeks.
Just leave them on a table or something?
On a table or anywhere, and then you can directly pot them in any potting soil, and they will root.
So and you leave them to dry, to have
callus.
that cut end dry up.
You want the cut end to heal, because if you were to take these cuttings fresh and put them into soil, they will rot.
Oh, okay. Yep. So dry them out first, then put them in the soil. Yep. Just lay them on top of the soil, or put them.
Okay, yeah. I would put them directly in.
Okay.
Yeah, especially for the the ones with actual stems, like plants like Echeveria, like these little rosettes, you can actually take off entire leaves, and they will produce an individual plant from each leaf.
Yeah, so putting little roots out from the bottom.
Oh, how cool!
So that's like every succulent has like different kind of propagational techniques, but I would say succulents are a lot easier to propagate than cuttings of a salvia or basil. That's a little more finicky.
But it's a fun science project for kids or grandkids if you want to see how different plants can propagate. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our next question. This has to do with insects. What do I do about insects that invade my garden?
Depending on whether you're somebody who wants to use any kind of pesticide, there are different ones. Some are, low-key organic if you want to go that direction with things.
Like neem oil is pretty
horticultural
broad.
oil. If you have infestations, diatomaceous earth is another one. If you have slug problems like I do at my house, I had to put diatomaceous earth, which is basically a powder of a ground up kind of rock, for lack of a better terminology, and that prevents bugs there. Some of it is just manual. If you get a tomato or tobacco hornworm on your tomatoes, just pluck that sucker off, throw it up and let the birds catch it. I don't know, something. And I've spent way too many hours trying to dig up beetle grubs out of the ground. Totally not worth the effort, because there are millions of them. So it's sort of a matter of what you're willing to tolerate in your garden. Some of it's easier to deal with. Other things might need a little more heavy-handed approach.
Like sometimes when you have you occasionally get infestations with aphids. Like just a strong jet of water can knock a huge amount of the population off. So, it all depends. But there are ways around using a lot of, kind of like toxic insecticides in the garden.
Yeah.
So does that work with, say, fruit flies? Because sometimes don't they get down in the soil?
There are some pests that do get down in the soil. And I'm trying to avoid having to answer those questions because it's more complicated than that. If you get, say, a mealybug infestation, which can go down into the soil, you're not going to get rid of it. And so it's going to, even if you address it up here, if they're down here in the pot, they're just going to reinfest the thing. And so I think to avoid a lot of frustration for many gardeners, I say just get rid of the plant and start over again. Okay. Because if you don't want to mess with the chemicals or even the manual stuff, it may not be worth the headache. Just start over with clean material.
Got it. Okay. So what is companion planting?
We keep looking at it. I would say companion planting, if you're talking about in the garden itself, you'll find people who, if they have, like, say, tomatoes in their vegetable garden, they will plant marigolds alongside, or they have corn, but they might want to grow some beans or something up along with it. You can do flowers and vegetables together, even in a container plant. He and I, when we were discussing this, Swiss chard there's some really beautiful cultivars of Swiss chard that have different colors. You can grow those in a container, and still harvest them as a vegetable, but you can also put the pretty flowers in there as well. So companion planting, I would say, combines the best of both worlds, where you can do the pretty and attractive with the utilitarian plants as well. And that can go for in the garden or in a container as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because like sometimes you're planting companion plants to attract pollinators,
Yeah.
to get your vegetables to to
pollinate,
fruit.
yes,
Yeah.
right.
We definitely want our pollinators.
Yeah.
Okay. So our next question, should I plant in containers, raised garden beds, or in the ground?
Yes.
Yes to all.
All of the above. I think unless you are severely restricted by space, in which case raised beds or containers would be most appropriate. I think there's space, and I mean literally, figuratively and literally, for all three of those concepts in a garden. You can certainly do all of these plants in the ground if you wanted to. If you maybe have some mobility issues, and a raised bed makes more sense for you to have it up higher where you can easily weed or tend to it. And then containers are a great accent feature for a deck or your front stoop, or even out in the, I have containers even in my garden itself. And so you can fit all of it in. I think the sky's the limit, and there's lots of fun colors to use and everything.
Yes.
So there's ways to make it really cool for, in those different ways. Yeah.
But another thing about raised beds is, when you don't have good drainage in your pre-existing soil, a raised bed is a great solution, other than trying to create sort of like berms, because a lot of plants need drainage in order to succeed, especially like vegetables, herbs. So, and also with raised beds, you can also control the soil nutrition better, because you know exactly what you're putting in there.
Right.
But yeah, but it's just an extra cost is the only thing. Like the cheap way of creating drainage is to create berms, sort of a false sense of drainage in pre-existing garden soil.
I love how he gets all the technical stuff in here, and I'm like, it's a pretty container. Yes, you do it. And Brad's like, no, you need to do it for better drainage. Like, okay, yes, there's that too. So, thank you, Brad.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we have time for maybe just a couple more questions. What is meant by deadheading my plants and flowers?
Deadheading is usually something people refer to with roses, and a lot of times if you do any deadheading, it may initiate some reblooming of the plant. Other times it's just aesthetic. So if this is starting to get tatty as the season goes on, I might come in and sort of nip off some of this stuff, and then it'll flesh out again and maybe produce some more flowers on it. So you kind of keep it from going into seed production mode. One of the things that Brad actually was mentioning before when we were talking was basil. Basil is one of those plants that's an annual. We talked about that before. It's going to try and produce seed at the end of the season. But you as the gardener or as the chef want the leaf production. We don't want it to go to seed.
Right.
So it's easy enough when this starts to go to flower, you can literally just pluck off, if you have pruners or something like that, and then take those flowers off. So it takes away this focus on seed or reproduction and back onto producing more leaves, and that'll extend your season a little bit longer so that you can make more pesto.
And I smell it just from that right there. I
Yes,
smell it. It smells
yes.
great.
Yeah, so some of them are really easy that you could pluck off flowers, just nip them off if you have some fingernails or some pruners or what have you, if you don't like the way the flowers are looking or you want it to not produce flowers. Some cases you want more flowers, so deadheading is a good way to produce more flowers.
Got it.
Again, going back to knowing the personality of the plants that you're working with.
Okay, so here's a question that I have, and I'm sure a lot of other people have too. When we go on vacation, whether it's a couple days or a week or 2 weeks, how do we maintain the moisture in our soils of our plants? Like how do we water them?
Yeah, this is a concern for sure. For a lot of the plants, I either get a neighborhood person, like a kid or my next door neighbor, to see if they will come over and water periodically. And I usually tell them based on how much rain we've had or something. They're going to come in, I'm like, check it, make sure if they need water or not. And that's the easiest way, is to have an actual physical person coming and checking on it. If you don't have something like that, then as Brad mentioned earlier when we were discussing this, you can take the containers and maybe put them in a shady part of your yard, even if you have a garage that doesn't get like blazing hot or something. Throw them under a tree, put them in your garage, water them really well before you leave. And then if it's a shorter trip, they'll probably be fine. But if not, if it's a little bit longer, as Brad mentioned, you might want to put some kind of like tray or a bowl or something underneath that you can put some water in, and then it will be slowly taking it up over the time frame. If you're going to be gone for a month, that's what you need to be growing. So plan your vacations accordingly around your containers, because you know everyone does.
Or, you know, sort of a battery powered automated, you know, hook up to your spigot with like a hose and a sprinkler. Well, not necessarily drip. I mean, you're just looking to like get the plants through.
Yeah.
So all you need is like a little bit of water over them, and that's a way if you're going long term.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
No, I didn't think about that. I've just been asking the neighbors to do it.
Well, the prices
Giving them cookies at the end.
The prices have gotten a lot more reasonable with these types of these technologies.
Forget giving neighbors the cookies. I'm just going to go automated. Just kidding.
Well, we have options, so that's good. All right. So, okay, this is going to be our last question. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. What type of plant should I start with as a beginner?
Basil.
And I think that's basil, right?
Yes.
Yes.
I think you can, again, get those at a garden center, usually in the culinary section, if you want a cooking kind of thing. But they're also very sensory, so you kind of get immediate satisfaction with them. They're pretty easy to grow. You can kill them by not watering them enough, so you have to be careful of that. But I would say some other plants like lantana is pretty indestructible. So if you have a friend who is into gardening, or if you talk to an extension agent or something, they can probably point you to ones that are easy for the beginner. Rosemary's another one. Some of them you just throw them in a pot, water them once in a while, and you're done. But there are always going to be people with black thumbs who, no matter what they grow, it's not going to go well for them. And that's okay. You just have someone like us come in and do containers for you and give us cookies.
Well, actually, I think after all of this, I think we're going to have a lot of green thumbs. So
that's good.
Again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
If we were not able to get to your questions today, we will have this video and resources and tips posted on our website at ars.usda.gov. And one more thing, if you have not visited the U.S. National Arboretum, make sure you visit. There's a lot to see here. Thank you for joining us.